ってきた。危ない。
Good evening, I'm G.I.JerryPrater. Subscribing and giving a like really helps this channel. If you've listened to my content before, enjoyed it, and you're liking what you hear here, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. Let's continue with the first story. Good evening, my name is Chase Hill and I'm from the state of California. I've been a truck driver for about 15 years now. I'm generally a very cheerful and friendly person with everyone I meet. My wife often criticizes me, saying I'm too trusting, that I act as if nothing bad could ever happen to me. I used to brush it off and tell her everything would be fine, with such a calm tone that it would drive her crazy. But the truth is, I knew she was right. And that's why I try to be more cautious during long trips. Still, I never expected that my kindness would lead me to one of the most terrifying encounters of my life. I was on a trip in another state. It was around 10 p.m. and I was driving my truck, listening to music and eating some snacks, when I started feeling a discomfort in my back and legs. I was getting tired, so I checked the map and saw there was a rest stop just a few kilometers ahead, near a small town. I figured it would be a good chance to refuel and stretch my legs before continuing the journey. The stop was pretty empty, with a small store where a family had stopped and a taco stand. A few meters away, I could see some isolated houses, and in the distance, the lights of the town. After filling up with diesel, I parked my truck and went into the taco stand to grab a quick dinner. The taco vendor greeted me warmly and prepared something for me to go. He asked where I was headed, and while we chatted, I kept an eye on my truck. That's when I noticed a little girl, maybe about 9 years old, approaching it and looking at it closely. I stared at her, surprised when she looked back at me. She was about 15 meters away. She smiled brightly, and I smiled back. Just then, the taco vendor looked at me and asked who I was smiling at. I told him, the little girl standing next to my truck. But when he looked over, he didn't see anyone. I turned again, and sure enough, the girl was gone. I found it odd how fast she disappeared. And I noticed how serious the vendor became as he calmly said, "Be careful about being too friendly with strangers." I laughed and told him that's exactly what my wife always says. I paid him, thanked him for the food, and got back in the truck to eat. I stayed parked there for a while, listening to a story by G.I.JerryPrater until around 11. I got out to stretch my legs again and waved goodbye to the taco vendor, who was closing up. I was just about to leave when I noticed the girl again, this time on the other side of the road, standing on the path that led toward the town. I figured maybe someone had sent her back to the store. It seemed strange that such a small child would be sent out at night. But I assumed it was a safe town and they weren't too worried. She waved at me, signaling for me to honk the horn. So I did. It made me happy to see her laugh, and then I continued my trip. After that trucker story video, I started listening to another one by G.I.JerryPrater. His voice kept me company for a good while. Since the podcast was about paranormal topics, it had an eerie atmosphere. So I wasn't surprised when I began hearing whispers and odd creaks. At first, they all seemed to come from the show. But then one sound stood out, loud and clear, and pulled me out of the story. I paused the podcast and sat still, eyes locked on the road. I could swear the whisper had come from inside the truck cabin. I was too scared to look back, and although I tried to convince myself it was just an echo from the podcast, when I replayed it, the sound wasn't there anymore. That really unsettled me, so I stopped listening to scary stuff and put on an audiobook instead. I tried to keep driving normally, but not long after, another whisper made me grip the wheel tight and sit up straight. I felt a chilling cold on the back of my neck and a terrible sense of dread. Like something bad was about to happen. Someone had gotten into my truck, and I hadn't even noticed. That thought kept circling in my head while I struggled to stay calm. I was in a pretty isolated stretch of road. If there really was someone else in the cab, I didn't want to act aggressively. What if they had a weapon? My imagination started getting the better of me. I almost had a panic attack, thinking my life might be in danger. The audiobook played in the background, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was completely focused on the cabin, straining to hear even the faintest sound. But everything was dead silent. I relaxed a bit, thinking maybe it was all in my head. But just as I let my guard down and reached for my water bottle, I felt a small hand touch my shoulder and give it a squeeze. I don't know how I managed to stay in control of the truck. My first instinct was to jerk away, and for a moment, I let go of the wheel. But I quickly grabbed it again and hit the brakes. I turned around and swear to God, there was no one there. I turned on the cabin light and looked in every direction. Nothing. No one. I pulled over to avoid an accident and tried to make sense of what just happened. Had I imagined it all? That would have made sense with just the whispers. But the pressure on my shoulder was real. I picked up my phone and called my wife. I didn't tell her what had happened. But I figured hearing her voice would calm me down, and it did. Once I felt better, I got ready to hit the road again. I looked in the side mirror to check for cars. And standing in the middle of the road was the girl from the gas station. My first thought was that maybe she had hidden in the truck. But I immediately realized that couldn't be, because I saw her wave goodbye back at the town entrance. I kept my eyes on her, and the hair on my arm stood up when I saw her raise her hand again, signaling for me to honk the horn, this time with a mocking smile on her face. I stared straight ahead and started the truck without looking back. Luckily, I didn't hear or see anything else that night, and I arrived at my destination around 7 in the morning without further issues. Even though I was terrified at the time, I slowly convinced myself that maybe it was the spirit of a little girl who didn't mean to harm me. Maybe she followed me because she felt attached to my kindness. But when I told my wife, she said something that made me think for months. If she didn't mean to hurt you, then why did she touch your shoulder? You could have crashed. And she was right. I could have lost control of the truck. And that mocking smile I saw on her face in the road was hard to explain away. I don't know if that taco vendor knew something I didn't. And I haven't had the chance to pass through that same route to ask him. But what I do know is that, ever since that night, I try not to be too kind to just anyone I meet on the road. Let's continue. Hello, community. My name is Saul, and I've been listening to JerryPrater for years. Since his stories help keep me awake on long night trips. I've had a couple of road experiences, but without a doubt, the one I'm about to share is the one that marked me the most. Before I begin my story, I want to ask you something. Do you believe in nature spirits? I'm not talking about ghosts or human souls or essences. I mean spirits tied to the earth and to animal life. You see, I didn't believe in any of that. In fact, I was an atheist who didn't believe in anything. But some time ago, I had an experience that directly put my life at risk. And I think it fits perfectly with the theme of this channel. Let me give you some context. I was born in Brazil, in the city of Sao Paulo. And if you're wondering, what's a Brazilian doing here? Well, my father is from Veracruz, and I spent most of my childhood there. We visited Brazil 2 or 3 times to see my mother's family. As for me, I won't go into many details about what I did back then. But let's just say I had a hard time finding my place in Veracruz. Eventually, I moved back to Sao Paulo. And luckily, my cousin Miguel helped me find a job at a lumber company warehouse. After several years, and once I got all my licenses in order, I was finally able to start working as a trucker for the same company. And that's where my story begins. At first, I drove small trucks, transporting wood to furniture factories. But as I gained experience, my boss started trusting me with larger trucks. Then one day, he asked me and an older man named Samuel to go to the Tala region in the state of Parana, in the southwest of Sao Paulo, because they were short on drivers to move logs to the sawmills. They gave us a company pickup truck, and about 7 hours later, we arrived in the Tala area. I should mention that Samuel and I didn't get along very well. We'd had some disagreements because we were both very stubborn. So the trip was quiet. I was driving, paying attention to every detail of the road to avoid boredom. When the landscape suddenly changed dramatically. It was 5 p.m. and thick vegetation gave way to miles and miles of barren land, with tree stumps covering the ground, stripped trees along the roadside, and mountains of branches scattered everywhere. It was an overwhelming sight. And suddenly the usual road sounds disappeared. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of wind coming through the window. I thought that was normal. Until Samuel suddenly broke the silence. They've really gone too far this time. No wonder they sent us here. I was surprised to hear him speak. And I thought about asking what he meant by gone too far. But I held my tongue. I assumed he was talking about the workload and kept driving. All I could see were chopped down trees and piles of branches on the horizon. As night fell, an hour later, we arrived at a huge depot. There were about 8 trailers already loaded with massive logs, secured with chains. Samuel and I got out to talk to the foreman. He told us we had to deliver the logs to a sawmill about 80 kilometers away, and that we could rest once we got there. But the delivery had to be made that same night, to avoid delays in the company's supply chain. I agreed right away, but something caught my attention. Several men were standing around the warehouse doing nothing, and the foreman seemed quite upset. There were more than 2 trucks loaded, but none of the other drivers were leaving. Then I heard Samuel say, "Sorry, boss, but my back's really hurting. I can head out at 6 in the morning if that's okay." That surprised me because I had done all the driving so far. Yet I was still willing to go a few more hours to make the delivery. The boss snapped. He said that's exactly why we were sent there in the first place, and started yelling at everyone in the warehouse, especially the drivers standing around. The same ones I'd seen earlier who refused to work. None of them said a word or even looked at him. I didn't mind going out alone. But then the boss said, "Convince your partner to go with you, or I'll call headquarters and have you both fired. You came here to work." I shrugged and pulled Samuel aside to talk. I asked him what was wrong, but he just stared at the sky. We were in a rural area, so the stars should have been visible. But the night was cloudy and very dark. He wouldn't pay attention to me. And then I saw something in his face I had never seen before. "What's going on? Are you scared, Samuel?" He looked at me and replied with total seriousness, "The night's not good for driving. Don't start that trailer like this." I wanted him to explain, but he refused. In hindsight, I think he didn't tell me, because he knew I wouldn't believe him. I was never a superstitious person, and everyone knew that. Also, since I was stubborn, if he told me the real reason, I probably would have insisted even more. I told him to just get in the truck so we could go. It was only a 2-hour drive. Samuel stayed quiet for a moment, as if he really wanted me to understand, then said with the most serious tone I've ever heard, "Wait until morning, and we'll go. You can't drive tonight. These bastards went too far." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't care to find out. I've always been impatient and hard-headed. I'm trying to work on that. But at that moment, I wasn't in the mood for nonsense. The company was strict about delivery times, and I didn't want to be penalized for being a day late. There was no way to convince Samuel. He even said I was just a fool who didn't understand anything. I was fed up. I told him I'd go alone, and he'd have to explain to the company why he stayed behind. Then he said something that still gives me chills. "If you even make it, idiot." I didn't say anything else. I got in the truck and drove off into the dark road we'd already traveled. The trailer was heavy and the road had no lights. So I was going slow, about 30 to 40 kilometers per hour. The silence became uncomfortable quickly, so I put on a podcast for background noise. Still, I kept thinking about Samuel's words. It was obvious he knew something I didn't. Suddenly, I started hearing strange sounds, like birds singing in the distance. At first, I thought it was the podcast, but I quickly realized it wasn't. The topic they were discussing had nothing to do with that. I began to feel uneasy, though I didn't know exactly why. For about half an hour, I kept hearing birdsong, flapping wings, branches breaking loudly, and other animal sounds from the darkness. I figured maybe the animals were looking for their old homes, and didn't want to blame it on anything supernatural, until I saw a gray flash to my left. I turned quickly and saw it again. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked like a flashlight. I brushed it off, thinking maybe a worker was out in the field, even though it made no sense for anyone to be out there that late. Then I saw a man standing at the edge of the road. Since I was driving slowly, I got a good look at him. He was dark-skinned, shirtless, and looking to the left. He only turned his head at the last moment when we made eye contact. I kept watching him through the side mirror, until he disappeared into the darkness. I was already nervous, but that shook me up even more. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I gripped the wheel tightly as I hit the gas. I felt an urgent need to get out of there, and made a major mistake. I started looking everywhere except the road. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something jump in front of the truck. A huge deer, about 12 meters away. I was going about 60 kilometers per hour, and did something truckers should never do, especially with such a heavy load. I jerked the wheel out of panic. I tried to brake and nearly caused the truck to tip over. I hit the deer directly, but somehow kept the truck on the road and managed to stop. When I realized what had happened, I was crying, unable to believe I had survived. I jumped out of the truck to check the damage and look for the animal, flashlight in hand. I walked about 20 meters back, and I swear on my mother, who is the most sacred person in my life, that instead of a dying deer, I found a huge tree trunk, over 2 meters long. No person could have thrown a piece of wood that big. I stood there stunned, lit by the truck's emergency lights, when I suddenly felt someone watching me. About 30 meters ahead stood the same man I'd seen earlier. My legs turned to jelly, and I nearly fainted when I heard a loud crash to my right. Out of the darkness, several gray deer leapt across the road, bellowing loudly as a horrible scream rang out. A scream I assumed came from that man. I panicked and ran back to the truck. I started it and hit the gas. At that moment, I remembered every childhood prayer I knew. I didn't look to the sides, not even when I began to hear something banging against the logs I was hauling. There was no peace during that drive, until I was just 20 minutes from the sawmill. The night shift workers were shocked that someone had actually arrived, but I didn't tell anyone what happened until the next morning. I lay down in the truck cab, but couldn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I waited for Samuel to arrive. When he saw me, he didn't say a word. He just touched my shoulder and said he was glad I was okay. We never talked about what happened, and we didn't become friends. But after that, I respected him more and listened to his advice. As for what I experienced, I did some research and came to the conclusion that I had witnessed the wrath of nature. How many lives, great and small, were lost in that area? I have no idea. But Samuel was right. They went too far. And something in that place was very angry. I don't know if the same thing happens every time, but ever since that night, I always wait for daylight before transporting loads through places like that. Let's continue. I don't like driving in the rain or bad weather, but because of my job, sometimes I have to. My name is Martin, and I've been a trucker for several years. Throughout my life, I've hauled various kinds of cargo, some more dangerous than others. And I've always driven with a lot of caution. So I'm proud to say I've never had an accident. However, I have experienced very tense moments where I wasn't sure if I'd make it out alive. And it's one of those moments I'm here to tell you about. Back then, I was transporting a heavy load from one Mexican state to another. So I had to drive at a very low speed. To be honest, the weather looked great. The sky was blue and clear, no clouds in sight. The area I was driving through was very mountainous, and the road was narrow. But I wasn't too worried as long as it stayed dry. Around noon, I stopped at a roadside rest area to eat. Near me, there was an older man having lunch, and he struck up a conversation because he liked my truck. He told me he had also been a trucker, and we talked for a while about the trade. When he asked where I was headed, his mood changed for the first time, and he asked which route I would take. He advised me to take the secondary road, which passed behind several small towns and villages. I asked him why, and he said the mountain road was dangerous at this time of year. When I asked what he meant, he simply said something very bad had happened on that road, and it was better to avoid it during those months. Even though I was usually pretty cautious and listened to locals' advice, I also hated taking back roads. They were often full of crime. I checked the map and saw that the secondary route would delay me by several hours. So I thanked him for the advice, but told him I needed to deliver my load as soon as possible and couldn't take a detour. He understood, gave me a blessing, and told me to be careful. The weather was going to get bad. After he left, I sat there a moment looking up at the clear sky. I didn't even feel a cold breeze that would suggest rain. I felt a little sorry for the old man, thinking he was just a bit senile. But I couldn't have been more wrong. I got back in my truck and resumed my trip on the main highway. It was around 1 p.m. and the road was empty and quiet. What struck me was how quickly the weather changed. A thick fog started rolling down the mountains, limiting my visibility, and a light drizzle began to fall. I turned on the wipers as the rain intensified, and even though I was already going slow, I reduced my speed even further. No exaggeration, I was driving around 30 kilometers per hour, because I could barely see ahead. I turned on my headlights, even though it was daytime, because dark clouds had blanketed the area and dimmed everything. The rain grew heavier, and I began to worry as the windows started fogging up from condensation. I felt an intense cold in my legs and back, and I remember the words of the old trucker at the rest stop. I crossed myself, unsure of what had happened on that road, but I prayed to God that nothing similar would happen to me. Just as I did that, I saw someone standing on the roadside. A woman with brown hair, wearing a floral dress. I saw her late because the fog only allowed visibility for a few meters. By the time I noticed her, I had already passed. I tried to look back through the side mirror, but I saw nothing. I figured my imagination was playing tricks on me. It was tormenting me with things that weren't real. And yet, I felt guilty. What if she needed help? There was nowhere to safely pull over, and stopping might have caused an accident if there was a car behind me. I honked the horn while slowing down a bit, hoping to catch her attention. But no one responded. All I could hear was the wind and rain hitting my trailer. I accelerated again. The road was going downhill, so I was nervous and took every turn carefully to avoid skidding. At one point, while taking a sharp curve very cautiously, a blue classic car passed me on the left. Maybe a Camaro or a Dodge from the 70s. It was going full speed, and I got scared because it could have caused a terrible accident. I still remember clearly the screeching of its tires as it accelerated and drifted through the turns. I was horrified by such recklessness. I listened as it sped away, until suddenly I heard a loud crash and the horn of a trailer like mine. I assumed the worst. It was obvious that the driver's carelessness had caused an accident. I proceeded with caution, expecting at any moment to come across a horrible crash. I grabbed my phone to call emergency services, but had no signal. The rain continued pouring down, and the fog still blocked my view. But then I saw two people on the roadside. A young man in his 20s with messy hair, and a girl around 18 wearing a floral dress. I recognized her immediately. She was the same woman I'd seen minutes earlier. I figured someone must have picked her up. I didn't have much time to think. I braked and rolled down the passenger window. I leaned over and asked them if they were okay, if they'd been in the crash. Neither of them answered. They just stared at me. And believe me, I have never seen a sadder pair of eyes in my life. I felt an intense chill on my neck and chest, and couldn't say anything else. I wanted to ask if they needed help, if I could do something for them, but I didn't dare. I rolled up the window and drove off, expecting any moment to see the wreckage of a mangled car, crashed into a trailer. But I drove and drove for 20 more minutes, and saw nothing of the sort. I started questioning what I'd seen and heard. But I'm not crazy and have never hallucinated. I know what I saw, and I'm sure what happened next was completely real. As I kept driving, trying to make sense of it all, I noticed a red drop hit my windshield. Then another, and another. I sank into my seat, trying to look up. And even though it seems impossible, it's true. From the pitch-black sky, drops of blood were falling, staining my windshield. The wipers struggled to keep the glass clear. And although I wanted to stop to avoid an accident, fear pushed me to keep driving, to get off that road as fast as I could. I was breathing heavily, hyperventilating from nerves. I could barely feel my legs from the cold, and I saw my breath forming little clouds. It felt like I was driving through a frozen winter. My fingers even felt numb. The thick red liquid covered the windshield, and for just 1 second, only one, the wipers pushed the blood aside, and I saw something that froze my soul. A horrible accident. A car, or what was left of it, impaled into what must have once been the cab of a trailer. A twisted mass of metal, soaked in blood. The windshield fogged up again, and when I looked again, the accident had vanished. At that point, all I could do was keep driving, and hope nothing else would happen. Later, my daughter explained that what I experienced was something called dissociation, a moment when your mind disconnects from reality. I think I drove through that rain of blood for about 10 more minutes, before clear rain began to fall, washing my windshield, and slowly the storm and fog started to fade. I drove the rest of the afternoon, and around 7 p.m. I arrived at a rest stop for truckers, where I found an old friend of mine. I told him everything that had happened, and even though he wasn't someone who believed in the paranormal, he told me that around 30 years ago, there had been a terrible accident on that road. A young man had fought with his girlfriend, and she left walking along the highway. He went after her, and they drove off, still arguing, in the middle of a storm. The young man was very drunk, and they didn't see the trailer coming. They both died instantly, along with the truck driver. Based on what I heard and what I experienced, it became clear that what I saw was a reflection of that tragedy. And beyond the fear, I felt deep sadness, because it was obvious those two young souls had not found peace. Months later, I passed that same route again. This time, nothing supernatural happened. In fact, the weather was very clear, and I saw some rusted car parts by the roadside, and a large cross decorated with flowers. So I imagine there are still people who remember the accident, and leave small offerings for the young couple, hoping that one day they'll find rest. As for me, I try to avoid the route in August and September. I stay safe by driving slowly, avoiding rain and fog, and praying to God that I never suffer a similar fate. Good evening, horror community. My name is Scott, and I've been a trucker for only a few years. Honestly, I'm still pretty new and still make rookie mistakes. But I always listen to my more experienced colleagues, and never hesitate to ask for help over the radio. Sometimes I meet up with them, either at truck stops on the road, or at the depot of the company we work for. And I always listen to their paranormal stories, and everything they've experienced out there on the road. Something they kept telling me was that sooner or later, I would see something out there. Witches, ghosts, shadows. There's always something that initiates you. It's inevitable, they said. Too many things happen on the road, and a lot of residual energy gets left behind. I took these warnings seriously, assuming that one day I'd witness a terrifying event myself. That idea got into my head because, honestly, I'm a bit of a scaredy cat. When I'd drive at night or on dark, rainy days, I'd often see things out of the corner of my eye, but nothing I couldn't explain with my imagination. Strangely enough, my first encounter with the supernatural was actually quite peaceful and comforting. Every time I was about to set out on a long trip, I would check over the truck I'd be driving. The company assigned them almost randomly, but the mechanic and I always took a moment to make sure everything was in order. But one time, I was in a hurry and had to just jump into the truck and go. Bad luck, because about a day into the trip, I started hearing a strange sound in the engine. A suspicious clicking noise coming from the right side of the truck. I got pretty nervous, assuming there was some mechanical issue. The last thing I wanted was to call the company in the middle of the night to say I had broken down halfway through the delivery. I radioed one of the colleagues I trusted most, and after explaining the situation and where I was, he recommended I take a detour of a few kilometers to a town he knew and spend the night there, to avoid damaging the truck further. He said, "Don't worry, Scott. My daughter's godfather lives there, and he's a good mechanic. He'll help you tomorrow. Let me call him and tell him you're coming. But don't keep driving like that or your truck might break down completely." That made me feel a bit calmer. So I took the detour to the town he mentioned. It was a pretty small place, and right off the highway, there was a mechanic's shop where I stopped. I figured it was the one my colleague had told me about. Since I was going to have to wait there, I got out to stretch my legs. The place was completely deserted, and aside from the light from the street lamps, it was quite dark. Across the road were a bunch of trees, and I saw several closed-up shops along the street. That made sense. It was around 1 a.m. I lit a cigarette, and suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I felt a chill down my spine, and spun around quickly, expecting to see a mugger. I even clenched my fists, just in case I needed to defend myself. But in front of me was only an old man wiping his hands with a rag. I remember him well, white short hair, glasses, sharp features but a kind smile. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit, and he chuckled and said, "Did I scare you, kid?" I laughed and admitted I was a little nervous. He asked me why, so I explained the situation with the truck and the clicking sound it had been making. He looked at the truck and said, if I gave him one of my cigarettes, he'd take a look. Since his wife didn't let him smoke anymore, he seemed quite competent and was friendly. So even if he hadn't been a mechanic, I would have given him the cigarette anyway. We stood there smoking for a few minutes, then walked over to the truck. We popped the hood, and he climbed up to inspect it. I stood below, shining my flashlight on the engine. I never knew much about mechanics, so I trusted him when I saw him go into the shop and come back out with some tools. He got back to work and asked me about my life. If I was married, how old I was, and how long I'd been a trucker. I answered him, and when I told him I was 28, he laughed and said, "My son, Jose Luis, is also 28. Still young. Take things slow, kid." He was a really kind old man, and his advice reminded me a lot of the things my own dad used to say. I was especially happy when he closed the truck's hood and told me to try starting it. I climbed into the cab, turned the key, and sure enough, the clicking was gone. I jumped out to thank him and noticed that the door to the mechanic's shop was closed again. I saw him standing by a pole and thanked him for everything he'd done. When I asked how much I owed him, he said I could pay his son in the morning, and then asked me something strange: to send his regards. I didn't really know how to interpret that. I figured maybe they had had a falling out and hadn't spoken in a while. I promised I would. He wished me a good night and disappeared down the path toward town. Since I had to stay and pay in the morning, I didn't hit the road that night. I climbed into the cab and quickly fell asleep. I don't know if it was related or not, but that night I dreamed of my father. I woke up in a good mood with the first ray of sunlight and went to grab breakfast at a nearby diner that had just opened. When I came back, the mechanic's shop was open, and I asked for Jose Luis. A man in his 50s came over to me. I hesitantly asked if he was Jose Luis, and he said yes and assumed I was Scott. My colleague had already told him I was coming, and he said he was about to check my truck. I told him it wouldn't be necessary. A mechanic had already helped me the night before. He and the other mechanic looked very confused and immediately told me that the only two mechanics in the whole town were the two of them. So I told them about the man from the night before, and although I hadn't asked his name, I described him perfectly, and I saw the surprise on both their faces. "If what you're saying is true," Jose Luis said, "then you spoke with my father last night." I told him yes, although I found it odd that he had said he was the same age as me, and I asked if they hadn't spoken in a long time, since he told me to send his regards. Jose Luis began to cry. And believe me, while it might seem obvious now, at the time I didn't understand what was happening. After a minute, he explained that his father, Jose Gregorio, had died many years ago, when Jose Luis was 28. His father had taught him everything he knew about mechanics, and was the best mechanic he'd ever known. And even though he had died in peace, it seemed he was still willing to help anyone in need. It took me a few seconds to process that the night before, I had smoked and chatted for several minutes with a spirit, but far from being scared, I felt peace. I stayed for a while talking to Jose Luis about what his father had been like. When it came to payment, he told me it wasn't necessary because he hadn't done anything. I said goodbye and got back in the truck. The very first thing I did once I sat down was call my father and tell him I loved him. We talked for a while before I hit the road again, and I promised to visit him soon. Anyway, that hasn't been the only thing that's happened to me on the road. I've had 2 other paranormal experiences that were far scarier, but this one is my favorite because it gave me peace and joy. It taught me that the supernatural isn't always scary or negative. Sometimes the souls that stay behind just have good intentions. Thanks for reading my story. These 4 stories remind us that kindness, caution, and emotional awareness are essential on every journey, whether on the road or in life. Enrique's ghostly encounter warns against blind trust, especially with strangers. Scott's peaceful brush with the supernatural teaches that some spirits, like people, may simply want to help. Both stories emphasize listening to your instincts and respecting local wisdom. In real life, we should remain kind yet vigilant, never ignoring red flags. Always check in with loved ones, stay grounded, And remember, sometimes the past lingers to guide us, not to harm us. Balance heart with caution in all things.